Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Well, we've had the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, visiting the Middle East, specifically Palestine, Israel, but he's also visited the likes of Jordan and Egypt to shore up and to ensure support for the ceasefire that has now come into place, specifically between Hamas and Israel, regarding all of what's happened recently across the occupied territories. There's also, of course, an effort by the Biden administration to recalibrate relations with the Palestinians that had worsened significantly under the tenure of Donald Trump. Will Biden, will Blinken and others within the cabinet be able to appease the Palestinians and bring them back to having fairly good relations or status quo relations, before the Trump tenure at this time, or has too much already happened to be able to then revert back to such a situation? We also have, of course, news about the reopening of the Jerusalem consulate, which is also a significant step on the part of the Americans. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Thomas Weiss, who is a distinguished fellow of global governance at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He's also presidential professor of political science at the City University of New York. He's joining us this morning from Chicago, Illinois. Dr. Randa is joining us from Dayton, Ohio. She's a fellow of the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And joining us from Bethlehem is Dr. Mazin, who teaches and does research at Bethlehem and Birzeit universities. Mazin, Randa, and Thomas, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Thomas, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of the Blinken trip? What do you make of the American stance, throughout what's happened recently in Palestine/Israel, as well as what may happen going forward vis-a-vis relations with the Palestinians?
Well, the rhetoric has completely changed, and the action has partially changed. After completely siding with Israel and giving away the store under the Trump administration with no return, I see what's happening now, the combination of Blinken and Biden, as being important steps in the right direction. Obviously not enough, but important steps in the right direction. It's hard to reverse the last 4 years or perhaps the last 70 years in a couple of days. But these are important steps. In particular, I think, as you mentioned, the reopening of the consular section for Palestinians and the announced effort of rebuilding, once again, Gaza.
Ryan, your thoughts on this, because the Americans have always, at least in my reading, have always said that they're the ones who will be the ones to broker peace, or they're the negotiator that can carry forward any peace process if that were to restart. But when you're that biased on one side, is that even possible? I mean, will that change under Biden? Can that change under Biden?
Look, I think we have a change in tone and rhetoric, for sure, especially, Mr. Secretary Blinken tried to emphasize the equal rights of Israelis and Palestinians to peace, dignity, happy life. However, the question is always for a mediator, is the mediator acceptable by both parties? That's, I think, still is the case with the United States, with both Palestinians and Israelis. But the question is the mediator interested and ready to invest time and resources in a negotiation process. And that's where I think the Biden administration is not, partly because it doesn't believe that there is a momentum. The Biden administration, especially when it comes to the Middle East, is interested in accelerating momentum, but not in creating momentum, especially when they determine in terms of investment of time and resources. It's clear that there is a pivot, and they are enacting a pivot away from the Middle East. So beyond the shoring up of the ceasefire, the real calibration of the relations with the Palestinians, the participation in a multinational effort to rebuild Gaza, the destruction that was wreaked by the Israelis, I don't see a plan yet being formulated for an investment of time and resources in relaunching peace talk, partly driven by the realization and by the assessment by the Biden administration, senior officials in the administration, that there is no momentum they can invest in to accelerate, and they are not willing to create one at this time.
Mazin, you're on the ground there. What are the thoughts about the American involvement at this time, the American stances? I mean, at the beginning of this latest bout of violence, the American response was fairly muted early on.
Well, I lived for a quarter of a century in the U.S. I'm a U.S. citizen also, in addition to being a Palestinian. My thoughts about the U.S. is that we have an image issue change and not substance change. The U.S. administration has long been, of course, a partner in crime with the Israeli government against the international law, against human rights, against UN resolutions. The U.S. used its veto power more times to protect Israel than to protect itself. The U.S. gives money to Israel more than it gives to sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America combined. And we, the Palestinian people, are no longer tricked by images and by words. We look for substance, and substantively, during the latest genocidal attack on Gaza, the Biden administration approved $735 million worth of military aid to Israel to use to kill Palestinians. So the U.S. is partner in crime. The U.S. cannot be a broker, cannot be a decent, any kind of peacemaker, so to speak, since it's the warmonger, it's the one that provides a criminal with his weapons, with his money, and with the support shielding from international law, and basically letting Israel get away from facing the International Criminal Court.
You know, I'm glad Mazin brought up that $735 million of, I believe it was precision-guided missiles, if I'm not mistaken. But there is, as you well know, Thomas, within especially the Democrat Party, there is a movement of some lawmakers who do want to then tie military aid to human rights issues as well as Israeli activities within the occupied territories, even though I believe Sanders has just over the past day or two walked that back, saying that he will still allow for military aid and the sale to go through. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, does that add enough pressure on the White House to possibly be more objective?
The short answer to your question is no. I think what's quite important, as you indicated, is that there is a shift going on. The BBC, I think an exaggeration, called the treatment in the United States a shift of tectonic plates. That is an overstatement, but there is certainly a huge change in the way even the mainstream media, such as the New York Times, has been treating the issue this time around. The fact that there was an effort to block what was a foregone conclusion of the transfer of military resources, I think, is significant. It obviously failed. I also think it's important to indicate just how little leverage the United States seems to have any longer in this situation, not only following the 4 years of the Trump administration, but $735 million of military aid 30 or 40 years ago was a huge infusion into Israel. Today, it's important, but it's not as essential. So it doesn't seem to me that the U.S. now has the opportunity to use the kind of leverage that military transfer used to imply. We may have missed an opportunity for U.S. leverage.
Very interesting. Randa, your thoughts on what Thomas just brought up? I mean, certainly the political cover, if I may use that phrase, at the United Nations, for example, that the U.S. provides is still vital, I would think. So, I mean, do you think that there is, and I know this argument has been made by other experts as well, that the U.S. role is, in fact, diminishing in this regard?
Yes, and it's due to two factors. I think one is the U.S., especially this administration, but also this has been a trend going all the way back since, you know, the debacle in Iraq after the U.S. invasion in 2003, is that there is this, shift towards not leaving the region. We still have the biggest assets in terms of military, economic, intelligence of any other country. Outside, of course, the region. But I think there is this trend that of shifting, away from the Middle East, out toward the Indo-Pacific region. Obama talked about that, was not able to really act on it. But I think with the decision of the Biden administration to withdraw from Afghanistan, you are seeing the implementation, the actual implementation of this policy of shifting away from the Middle East. That's one factor that is affecting the leverage. And more importantly, I think there is still leverage. It's just a question, do they want to exercise this leverage? And that's my argument, that they are not really interested, or they don't see it's worth their time and effort. That's one. But second, the region itself has changed. You now have more regional dynamics are more of a driver, in my opinion, of the tempo of regional politics than what outside actors can do. And I think the U.S. administrations have been, especially Obama administration, and now the Biden administration is realizing that there are now dynamics that are outside their control and that, are going to be enacted there and influence the tempo of politics in the region.
And, if I may, I mean, one of the regional issues, obviously, and changes has been the Abraham Accords, the normalization of ties with Israel on the part of the UAE, Bahrain, importantly, of course. Does that change things? I mean, the U.S.'s diminishing role, these Abraham Accords, what then do the Palestinians do next? I mean, is this dependence on Abu Mazin, Mahmoud Abbas, or is this then a search for independent policymaking who then picks up the mantle on the part of the Palestinians?
Well, the changes that the previous colleague mentioned, there are some changes. The changes is the strengthening of resistance, an axis of resistance that's growing. And every time Israel attacks Palestinians, thinking this will make them power and accept its colonial policies, they're surprised by the level of resilience and resistance to this. This is what changed. What changed is that the fear factor that was there before, and the use of the military in massive power and attacks on neighboring countries and on civilian populations under its control. I'm talking about Israel attacking citizens in its within area of its control. Those attacks used to give it political leverage. It is no longer that way because the fear factor has gone, and people are now resisting. And we saw with Gaza even that inflicted panic in Israel, that it besieged 2.1 million Palestinians, 2/3 of them refugees, displaced people, but nevertheless besieged, controlled, were able to inflict some pain on the Israeli cities, so to speak, and that is a change in the equation. This change is what forced the U.S. administration to come back, so to speak, to save Israel, because I agree with the previous speakers, Biden administration was not really very interested in the Middle East because they thought it's under control and that Israel has it under control, and they have normalization with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Sudan and so forth. And suddenly, all the equation is changed. It changed because of the Palestinian resistance. This is what changed, and it forced the U.S. administration to come back to try and salvage something for Israel, to try and deal back with the Oslo gang, I call them, in Ramallah, who are interested in their own positions, like a Vichy government under the Nazi occupation of France. And when Blinken said he's giving millions to the Palestinians, he means he wants to give millions to Ramallah so that they can continue to have security cooperation with Israel and protecting Israel from Palestinian resistance. Right. Unfortunately for them, this is not working, and it will not work anymore because the people are far too aware. For demonstrations around the world, we saw millions of people out on the streets. So it has changed. The situation is changed.
Thomas, I'm going to give you the final word, just a minute and a half we have left. I just want to get your final thoughts about what we've been discussing. And I wanted to then ask you, is the U.S. then siding with the like of Mahmoud Abbas at this point in time smart in the sense of propping him up, ensuring that, as we've heard Blinken said, that we need to ensure, or on the part of the U.S. that is, that whatever funding goes into Gaza doesn't support Hamas. And I'm not saying that they should, but I'm just saying that that seems to, again, be a message that Mahmoud Abbas is the one being propped up, even though the elections, as we know, have now been delayed for the unforeseen future.
It seems to me that the fiction that the Palestinian Authority is in charge of Gaza has been exposed on several occasions, so that the idea that all of the U.S. aid and other aid they're trying to mobilize from the region is going to pass through the Palestinian Authority, which is in cahoots with the Israeli government, seems to me a rather large fiction. I would like to emphasize what a colleague just said. I think the biggest change is not what's going to happen from the United States or other regional partners, but it's the new alliance between Palestinians who are in Israel and Palestinians who are in the occupied territories. That new movement, or I don't say movement anyway, a more obvious internal dissent is what Israel is going to have real problems in controlling. I think the idea that the two-state solution is still alive is what is really the biggest fiction characterizing the Biden administration's stance. It seems to me that that's been dead for a long time. And we're increasingly beating a dead horse.
Very well, leave it there at that, but we really appreciate Thomas, Randa, and Mazin for taking their time out of their no doubt busy schedules to share their expertise with us. We were discussing there Secretary Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State's visit to the region, the Biden administration's efforts towards supporting the ceasefire that is now in place between Hamas and Israel, even though, of course, both sides may argue there have been significant violations ever since the ceasefire went into effect. Nevertheless, what is the U.S. role? We've spoken about a diminished U.S. role. Then what does that then mean for Palestinians? As Councillor mentioned right at the end, one of the significant factors has, yes, been Palestinian unity, be it Gaza, West Bank, as well as within those who are, in fact, citizens, quote unquote, of Israel, those who are Palestinian citizens of Israel, that is, and the unity that we saw amongst this group, which we had not seen in the past, and that then being a significant movement, for lack of a better word, that may very well then add the kind of pressure that possibly may help the Palestinian cause going forward. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss something that we have discussed a number of times in the past on this show, and that is specifically about racism and Islamophobia, more specifically, within both the Conservative and Labour parties. But in this instance today, we're going to discuss the Conservative Party because an independent report, a 44,000-word report, in fact, has detailed Islamophobia within the ranks of the Tories in the UK. Now, this, again, is not surprising in and of itself because we have had in the past Prime Minister Boris Johnson, before he became Prime Minister, of course, and his views on Muslim women, for example, especially those who wear niqab, looking at letterboxes, and he's made many other such statements in the past as well, which have been perceived as Islamophobic. Nevertheless, it's also the denial, overall denial, that this sort of thing is even a problem for the party, which I would think is the more troubling part of all this. The Conservative Party has said that looking at this report, it will see and we'll try to study it, and try to come up with its next steps. What should be done at this point in time to deal with Islamophobia? Why is it that hard to admit that this is a problem? Because if we're not even admitting it, then how exactly are we meant to then deal with the situation of Islamophobia overall? Let's discuss that a bit further, and I'm joined with Ms. Rabina Khan, who is a councillor. She's a Liberal Democrat councillor, in fact, and a special advisor. She's joining us today from the British capital, London. Rabina, as always, we sincerely appreciate your taking our time out of your busy schedule to join us today. As I said, this is not something new, so it's not like we haven't discussed this before, but again, it proves that this is a problem within Tory ranks. But why can't they just admit it and then move on to the next stage?
Well, first of all, the fact that there has been a review that's taken place, that's welcoming. So between 2015 and 2020, I think 727 incidents took place, and that was looked into. And the review was carried out by an independent person, Professor Sarwan Singh. And that's important because it wasn't someone within the Conservative Party. It has been a very difficult time for the Conservative Party, and the question why they took so long, sometimes when you have a problem, you tend to shy away from it, you tend to reject it. And so Baroness Waqar was very good in terms of pushing for this review, and it can only serve good by having that review. The Labour Party had to have a review within anti-Semitism and the prevalent forms that it took place within their own party. So the Conservatives have to look into this as well. They also have to look within the kinds of comments that they made. You touched upon the Prime Minister now, who's the Prime Minister in his former position. He made the comments about Muslim women being letterboxes and bank robbers. Now, that had a profound effect on Muslim women. 700, I think it was the increase of Islamophobic attacks increased by about 315%. And that shows that people in power have a great effect on what happens on a ground level. Now, Professor Singh, what he called out is that there were profound implications for Muslim communities who the insensitive comments that were made had a profound impact on those communities. He also said that the senior leadership, their behavior had a role to play in this. And so you just only have to look at the current Prime Minister. I mean, he has apologized, but the ultimate question is, he's apologized and said that he would not make these comments. He's the Prime Minister now. Once upon a time, he's not going to be a Prime Minister. Will he go and revert back as a journalist to make those same comments?
Let's discuss politics of this, if we may, Rabina. Muslims within the UK are an important voting bloc as well, of course. I mean, they don't all vote as one group. They have their individual leanings within their group. But nevertheless, I would think that if the party does not deal with this, that does turn off those voters. Am I right to say that?
Yes, it potentially can. So there are 3.3 million Muslims living in Britain as we speak, and they make an enormous contribution to the British economy. £31 billion worth of contribution is made by Muslim communities in the UK. That has to be recognised by the Conservative government. Now, about 3 years ago, I wrote an article following the comments made by the Prime Minister and also a reflection of the former mayoral candidate, Zach Goldsmith, in 2016. When he stood, he was heavily criticised for the very racist and Islamophobic campaign that he ran against his opponent, Sadiq Khan, a Muslim man from the Labour Party, who is now the current mayor of London. What it shows is that you will lose votes in the future. You need to, as a party, value the contribution that we as Muslim communities make in the UK. And the Conservatives can do this. They can reach out and look at the recommendations that Professor Singh has put out, including a transparent complaint process to be put in place within the Conservative Party, and also an outreach strategy to the Muslim community. And let's also not forget, in 2013 and 2014, it was in fact a coalition government with the Conservative Party that introduced Sharia finance, also introduced measures in place so that Muslim communities could access the right to buy according to their faith.
Right.
So where it's been done in the past, and they can do this. Now, I would say and urge the Conservative Party to look at the recommendations made by Professor Singh. He pointedly raised the question of the leadership and their behaviour as part of that review.
If I may for a moment move away from just Conservative Labour and talking about parties necessarily, but also look at just policy making overall, right? As it affects Muslims. So now we have a lot of criticism of, for example, the PREVENT program, especially in its earlier days. Now it's seemingly been expanded to also include right-wing extremism. And that's not to say that those same mistakes should be repeated for anybody who may have such leanings as well. But what do you make of that? I mean, do we need to have such policies as well revisited to ensure that they're not then unfairly, for example, targeting Muslim children in this case?
Post 9/11, it was actually the Labour Party and the Labour administration government that brought in the Prevent strategy. And at the time, the Prevent strategy was about prepare, prevent, and making sure that Britain was safe. As part of that, they also did deliver some good things about promoting the positive images of Muslim communities, particularly young people. I was part of one of the Prevent projects trying to promote positive images of Muslim communities. But it has gone to another level in which we have to look at Prevent again so that we can avoid exclusion, suspicion, and that term of othering the Muslim communities. So I really do believe that the Prevent strategy now, as part of this review, needs to be revisited, re-looked at, and look at the way that it can be delivered, not only to safeguard the British public, but also to safeguard UK British Muslims in this country.
And then, the controversy, as you well know, Rabina, about around Eid especially, and such other important events on the Muslim calendar. And there was talk about how that was going to be a super spreader event, families got together, etc. As there was a lot of hyperbole around that time, especially when it comes to the UK media as well. All of that plays a part in this, right? And I'm not talking specifically, of course, about Conservative Party. I'm saying just overall in the atmosphere and in the image of Muslims.
Absolutely, and it's a tragedy because it was not ordinary people. Ordinary people during last year's pandemic were really, really good. Their faith celebrations, events, observations were done digitally, online, through Zoom. They supported each other. And then you have Craig Whitaker, who then makes a reference about Eid and the possible super spreading of Eid. And yet we neglect the fact that in the British seaside Bournemouth, there were people already going out there. Many of them were not from Muslim communities or Black or Asian minority communities. So the language and the narrative that is often built around certain communities needs to be reflected on. And it's usually people in power, people in public places, public office, who make that narrative, who go out and develop that narrative. They themselves have to have some sort of training on this. And I think that as part of the review that's looked into the Conservative Party, some of these politicians actually have to consider the language that they use. To go around and throw around lazy stereotypes and generalizations about certain communities does nothing but negative responses, not only from those communities, but the other communities who will interact with them. And it's important to realise that often ordinary people actually want to get on with each other. And when politicians play this narrative of setting one community against another, that is irresponsible, and that sets the agenda against community cohesion.
Indeed. And a pertinent point to leave it there at as a concluding remark. We do sincerely, though, appreciate Rabina for taking her time out, for speaking to us. She was speaking to us there from London. She's a Liberal Democrat councillor and special advisor. We were discussing there this report that's come out by, as Rabina there correctly pointed out, an independent investigator, 44,000-word report, no less, about Islamophobia within the Tory party. Again, not a surprise, as we both discussed. Nevertheless, it's important to have this laid out, and it's important, the fact that this was not done on a partisan level, but this was in fact done by an independent expert, laying out the case for why there is significant Islamophobia within the Tory party, and then, of course, recommendations laid out as well. Will Boris Johnson, who has apologized for some of his comments in the past that have been seen as Islamophobic, will he actually act now? It's time to admit it and then act to ensure that this does not then happen again, because as we've discussed, Muslims, A, make a very important contribution economically to the UK, but B, they are also a very important voting bloc, and this can very well also hurt Conservatives politically. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, and in the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss once again what's happened throughout the occupied territories recently, and the fact that on social media especially, as well as traditional media, we can probably discuss about censorship of some sort, with a lot of Facebook accounts, for example, being outright banned and or suspended for their posts regarding what was happening in the occupied territories, be it Gaza or otherwise in Jerusalem or elsewhere. We also, of course, have had various people within, celebrities, if I may call them that, who have, some of them in fact, have walked back some of their comments as well, possibly indicating again the kind of pressure that they've been put under behind the scenes. And at the same time, we've had news organizations overall, such as the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, that haven't even really broached the topic in a fair fashion altogether, which again then begs the question, why is it so hard to give neutral, objective coverage to what is happening in the occupied territories? Why is there this need to have this biased coverage, and why are the algorithms, if that is what is to blame according to Facebook and others, why are the algorithms set up in such a prejudiced fashion to then target those who are pro-Palestine in quotation marks? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Yousef and Helou, who is a political analyst and journalist. He's joining us today from London. Joining us this morning from Williamsburg, Virginia, is Dr. Stephen Sheehi, who is a Sultan Qaboos Professor of Middle East Studies at William and Mary University. Stephen and Yousef, thank you both for taking your time out to join us today. Stephen, I'd like to start with you. One of the major examples, if I may use that term, of what has happened vis-a-vis bias and prejudice is what's happened, in fact, to the Associated Press reporter Emily Wilder. She's been sacked by AP, and that's created a whole ruckus behind the scenes for AP itself. And that was, of course, an AP office that had been targeted in Gaza as well. Now, is that indicative, do you think, of this attempt to control the message that comes out of those regions?
Thank you, Waqar. I think this, Emily Wilder's case illustrates something very important, and that is, it shows us the collusion of corporate power with state power. And in this case, it also shows us the corporatization and the global corporatization of media, right? So one wonders, of course, who's controlling the message, et cetera. And that sounds always very sinister, but and centralized, right? Like there are 5 people in New York City deciding what comes out or not. But I think there's something more sinister going on, and that's a systemic structural silencing of Palestinian sentiment, a pro-Palestinian sentiment, because all one state has to do is complain to a multi-gazillion-dollar corporation that this content is provocative, incendiary, etc., then those corporations can sort of say without prejudice, oh, well, we were just getting complaints from Israeli security or from U.S. security or from Indian security, right? When we see this with censoring anti or critical Modi sentiment in India. So I think that's one thing we have to look at. I don't think it's been discussed enough, right? That is, this is the collusion between state power and corporate power, and we know that now Facebook and all its social media outlets, is one of the most powerful corporations in this country, in this world, that controls incredible amounts of information. And so I think that's really what we have to look at first. And the fact, of course, that there's a groundswell of pro-Palestinian sentiment for the first time in so long in unprecedented ways, this collusion becomes more apparent.
Indeed. Yousef, what do you make of that? I think it was a very good point that Stephen there made, that it does seem like there is this collusion happening. And at the same time, we did have at the beginning, I believe it was Facebook officials who met as in virtually with Israeli officials. And then there was also then a meeting, I believe, between Nick Clegg and a Palestinian official as well, again, virtually, to reassure the Palestinians that there wasn't an anti-Palestine stance on the part of the social media network. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, since the rise of the internet, traditional media is no longer dominates the narrative, and with the social media, replacing, or let's say, having an effective role, Palestinians have been relying on social media. Now, it's I call it a blackmailing policy on part of some of the powerful media outlets such as Facebook, social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and even WhatsApp. Some journalists, they reported that their WhatsApp numbers, they were blocked from participating in the WhatsApp groups. So Israel is doing its best to block the Palestinian voices. It's a censorship. It's a way to twist the facts. It's a way to manipulate the facts as if Israel is the victim, whereas the Palestinians are the victims. And social media give Palestinians at least a voice. It's a window of solace through which they can convey their narrative, their story, unedited, without editorial policies. So they tried to assure the Palestinians that Facebook didn't mean it, or WhatsApp or Instagram. But as a matter of fact, we know it's a systematic campaign to silence the Palestinian voices.
Stephen, one of the arguments, and I've seen, in fact, this play out a lot, especially on Twitter and even Facebook to an extent, is that of using anti-Semitism, or misusing, in fact, if I may use that phrase, anti-Semitism, to essentially say that all criticism of what Israel did is again, hateful and hateful against all Jews, etc. Not to say that there isn't anti-Semitism online, it's just that, is that even a fair label to use that then to target essentially anybody who wants to criticize what Israel's done online, that is?
That's an excellent question, and it's an unfortunate one we have to ask, because we do know that the preponderance of anti-Semitic material online and elsewhere, but we're not censoring Fox News, right? And we know that Israel has used the canard of all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. What we have to recenter is a fact that what is the news that is, or what is the information that is not getting out? What is it that becomes anti-Semitic? When you have a hashtag that says Save Sheikh Jarrah or Gaza under attack, and call this anti-Semitic, we know that something political is going on. We know that the canard of anti-Semitism is being deployed to suppress really the reality on the ground. And we have to remember what the reality on the ground in Jerusalem, in occupied Jerusalem, it's land confiscations, whether it's Sheikh Jarrah or Silwan or the Old City. In Gaza, it was war crimes. I mean, blowing up a 14-story building, children and families being killed en masse in toto, the Haram al-Sharif being invaded. I mean, imagine if the Italian police, who actually have legitimacy in Italy, invade, the Vatican. I mean, imagine the outcry. And there is an outcry, and that outcry also is being tempered or censored or trying to be managed, right? Because right now, the world, the popular movement for the liberation of Palestine, outside and inside, is operating in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time. So that's the information that is trying to be negotiated through using these sort of, canards of anti-Semitism or anti-Israel or Islamophobic tropes like Hamas is a terrorist organization.
Yousef, you've spent a lot of time in Gaza, of course, as a journalist as well, and I know you have family back there too. Is this then accusation that this coverage that comes out of Gaza, I mean, on the Palestinian side, is anti-Semitic or has roots in anti-Semitic? Is that fair? Because I was just reading today, in fact, about a Jewish journalist, an Israeli Jewish journalist, who was talking about, in fact, the fact that her communication with Gazans is, in fact, being such that they've said it very clearly that we actually have nothing against you personally as a Jew. It's actually our issues with, be it Zionism, Israel, and its actions, respectively.
Yes, in parallel with the Israeli aggression on Gaza, where Palestinians were united supporting the resistance, because Israel did not differentiate between a military target or a civilian target, an online battle was taken on, was ongoing on these social media outlets. And of course, Israel also prevented foreign journalists from coming into Gaza under the pretext that it cares about their security and safety. But whereas we know from previous experiences, Israel intentionally prevents those journalists from coming to Gaza to document what's going on. Obviously, when you have foreign correspondents who speak excellent English, of course, that will be more effective. Whereas if those media outlets rely on locals, then somehow the message could be a little bit weak. But let me shed light on also something else to do with censorship online. It's ironic that even the kufiyya now is being classified as a symbol of terrorism. So there is something going on behind the scenes between officials from the Israeli government with the management of those social media activists to underestimate the efforts of Palestinians for freedom. And it seems they are limiting the narrative, the Palestinian narrative. They are limiting reaching out to people worldwide, as if Palestinians, they have no right to convey their message.
Steve, I have about a minute left, so I want to give you the final word before I let both of you go. I don't want to end on a negative note because, as you alluded to earlier as well, I mean, we have seen an outpouring of people who've been able to still get their message across on social media, regardless of the fact that many of them have been censored. It seems like a lot of work on the part of Israel to try to control the narrative. I mean, why not allow for this free speech, and then, if it's so confident in its stance, allow for all of the above to have their say?
Well, we know why. Because the Israeli state and its accomplices want to naturalize settler colonialism in occupied Palestine. And what we see and what we have always seen is that popular resistance in Palestine refuses to disappear, right? And now on a mass level, more and more, those of us who have been organizing outside, we see a massive outpouring of support and recognizing that the legitimacy of Israel is in question because it is precisely an occupying power. It is a settler colonial state. It's an apartheid state that oppresses and tries to dispossess Palestinian people. This is a fact. These are empirical facts now. We recognize these as empirical facts. And the Israelis and its allies have to try to gain control over this narrative, but the Palestinian people and their resilience and their work and the resistance is being recognized now in ways that it never has been, and that is that's hard toothpaste to get back in the tube.
Indeed. Leave there at that, but we really appreciate both Stephen and Yousef for sharing their insight with us. We were discussing their media overall and how it's been treated throughout what's recently happened across the occupied territories, both social media as well as traditional media and journalists such as AP journalist Emily Wilder, as well as CBC Canada. I mean, the list really goes on, actually, if we start listing media organizations that have tried to control the narrative coming out of their respective journalists and or targeting them or punishing them even unfairly for daring to have a point of view on what's happening on the ground there. And then on top of that, the censorship on social media. Disturbing, of course, because social media, as we've discussed previously, is meant to be a market of free exchange of ideas. And if you try to control that, and you aren't able to, certainly as we can currently see, this will only really backfire on you, and it'll only make you look like you're the one who's trying to suppress free speech, as we currently have now egg on the face of the likes of Facebook, Instagram, and others. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.